Captain Chandler Smith here at U.S. Army Warrior Fitness Team, and I'm here to talk a couple things about conditioning and kind of building an engine. It's a question people always ask ahead of functional fitness competitions, like how do I build bigger lungs, right? Because bigger lungs equals more endurance, you can recover more quickly, you can do more reps faster. Like it's basically at the center of improving in pretty much any functional fitness sport. So the good news is that even though functional fitness as we know it here in the year 2020 is a relatively new phenomenon, there's a lot of knowledge to be drawn from sports that have histories that extend way earlier than functional fitness. You can look at how rowers and runners, for me specifically, those two domains are where I've learned the most in regards to building conditioning. And the first step is you always want to have a base phase. So in this base phase, what's important is kind of you're treating it as practice. You're building up good motor patterns. You're learning to move through the movements efficiently, and you're going to build efficiencies as you continue to go. But the volume is probably the most important factor during this base phase. And it's also like the longest phase of any part of the season. So for the fitness team and for functional fitness athletes, things that would kind of represent that would be like going on a 5-mile run at kind of a 70 to 80% effort. And in the mornings for us, for the Warrior Fitness Team, we do a lot of conditioning pieces where we have something like for rowing, there'll be a stroke rate restriction, or there'll be a pace given, or there'll be an RPE prescribed. An RPE is a rate of perceived exertion. That'll kind of cap how quickly you're moving. So that way you don't go so hard that your body's unable to recover in time for, the second workout or the workout the next day, but where you're still building what they call mitochondrial density. I'm not a scientist, so if I'm using that incorrectly, I apologize. But that's how we kind of do our base building phase. So this is kind of goes from the off season, and it's the longest phase of the year. So if I was looking at a traditional CrossFit season, this phase would be going for 4 to 6 months ahead of the open. And then a couple months ahead of the open, you start to transition, like you change the balance of volume and intensity. You never quite leave out intensity, and just with anything else, you never totally neglect any area. So we'll occasionally have some high intensity pieces in the mornings for our conditioning specific work, but the ratio of that will change, and there'll be a lot more intensity focused pieces mixed in. So as we get closer from that base phase, we will throw in what have been characterized as like sharpeners. We call them anaerobic sharpeners, and so those are more quick intervals. So if we were just speaking from the running framework, from the 5-milers, then maybe we'd go into 2 by 2 mile with 10 minutes rest in between. 10 minutes is a little bit long for most endurance athletes, but for CrossFitters, we're not like pure endurance guys, and we can't quite recover in between sets like some traditional endurance folks. So that's just like an example. I'm kind of throwing stuff off my head. And then as we get closer to competition, our time under tension and intensity is going to more closely replicate the events that we're going to see as CrossFit athletes. And for us, that means that we'll be working primarily within the 5 to 15 minute range for the majority of our workouts. So instead of the previous workout, like a 5-mile run takes around 40 minutes, that 2 by 2 would include roughly 25-ish minutes of work. We'll start to work in domains that more closely represent what we're going to see in competition. So we'd run maybe 1-2 mile at a 90 to 95% intensity would be more indicative of the type of conditioning specific piece we'd have as we get closer to competition. The problem, if there is a problem, is that type of intensity, that 90 to 95%, it's tougher to recover from and is not necessarily sustainable over a long period of time. So you still have to balance that out with your low intensity steady state work, which is kind of what I was referring to earlier in this talk about the base phase. So we still balance in a good amount of that, but the ratio is always changing. So broadly speaking, if you identify that you have a competition in X period, you probably want to take around, if we divide it into fifths. I take the first 60%, 3/5 of your time training into building that base phase, or building your base aerobically. So predominantly your workouts would be like those low intensity steady state pieces, a lot more volume over intensity. As you get a little closer, you'll build in more intensity, more interval type work, but work that's still working past your like the time requirements of your competitive events. And then as you get closer, you want to most closely replicate those events, whether that's actually performing them exactly as they are or just kind of like replicate the time demands. And I think that you rinse and repeat that process, and you'll find that your conditioning is improving at a rate that allows you to be a little bit more competitive every time you go out and get on the floor.